Have you ever stopped to think about what really happens in places when there's no one around? In forgotten basements, empty hallways, those corners where the light never fully reaches? Because what I'm about to tell you will make you rethink every time you're alone in a place that's too quiet. When Sarah Mitchell, the manager of the Riverside Building in Chicago, descended the stairs leading to the basement that Friday night, she expected to find James, the most punctual and reliable janitor that building had ever had. It was almost midnight and she just wanted to confirm that everything was closed before the weekend. But what Sarah found in that basement changed everything. It changed her life. It changed the history of that century-old building. And it definitely changed James forever. There he was, sitting in the darkest corner of the basement, huddled against the cold concrete wall, trembling, his hands covering his face, and whispering incessantly, as if trapped in some kind of trance. "I warned you. I warned you not to stay. I warned you." Sarah turned on her phone's flashlight, illuminating his face. James's eyes were wide, fixed on something she couldn't see. Deep, dark circles marked his pale skin. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, because in fact he hadn't. Here comes the part that made Sarah call 911 with trembling hands. James had been completely alone in that basement for 3 whole days. 3 days. Without going out, without eating properly, without sleeping. And when she approached, calling his name, trying to bring him back to reality, he kept whispering those words. But he wasn't talking to her. His eyes remained fixed on an empty point in the darkness, as if he were responding to someone, or something, that Sarah couldn't see. Have you ever felt that shiver when you realize something isn't right? That feeling that you should leave a place, but something is holding you there. Stay with me until the end, because this is the true story of James Mitchell, an ordinary 52-year-old man who discovered in the worst possible way that some places hold secrets buried for almost a century, secrets that should never have been revealed. And it all started with something so simple, so innocent, a shift change he agreed to do. What did James see during those 3 days alone in the basement? Why couldn't he leave? And most importantly, who was he talking to in that dark corner? To understand what happened to James in that basement, we need to go back a few days. We need to know who he really was. Because this isn't a story about ghosts or urban legends. It's about a man of flesh and blood, with bills to pay, a family to support, and choices that seemed simple at the time. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If this story is already giving you goosebumps, if you're feeling that tension building, please like this video now. Seriously, it makes a huge difference. And if you've never been here before, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you real stories like this one, cases that affect us, that make us question what really exists beyond what we can see. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that makes you think, that makes you feel. And listen, I really want to know from you. Have you ever been in a place that seemed to be begging you to leave? Have you ever felt that inexplicable presence, that weight in the air? Scroll down to the comments and tell me, because I read them all, truly. This exchange with you is what gives meaning to all of this. I know this topic resonates with you, so leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, what you're feeling as you watch this story unfold. Now, let's get back to James Mitchell. And believe me, what you're about to discover in the next few minutes will make you understand why that man sitting in the basement was whispering that he shouldn't have stayed. James Mitchell was 52 years old when all this happened. 15 years working in the same place, in the same building, doing the same job every day. For most people, that might seem monotonous, even repetitive. But for James, that routine was his anchor. It was what kept him going after losing his wife 8 years ago. Cancer took her too quickly, and since then, work had become more than just a job. It was his way of continuing, of having a purpose, of waking up every day knowing exactly what to do. Everyone in the Riverside Building knew James, the quiet, polite janitor who always greeted everyone with a discreet nod. He was never absent, not even when he had a cold, not even when the Chicago winter lashed him with that bone-chilling cold. James would simply show up, do his job, and leave. punctual as a Swiss watch. The tenants trusted him, management trusted him, and he was proud of that reliability he had built. Over so many years, the basement was his territory, that subterranean labyrinth full of narrow corridors, old boilers, exposed pipes, and dusty archives of the building constructed in 1924. James knew every pipe, every valve, every switch in that place. He knew where the ceiling leaked in winter, which boiler made a strange noise but worked perfectly, where the boxes with decades-old documents that no one cared about anymore were kept. He had an almost intimate connection with that space. It was as if the basement were an extension of his own life, silent, functional, forgotten by most. But there was something James always religiously respected, an unwritten rule passed down from janitor to janitor since he started working there. Never be alone in the basement after 10 o'clock at night. No one explained why clearly. Some said it was just a precaution, a matter of safety. After all, if something happened down there, no one would hear your screams. Others made that strange face, looked away and quickly changed the subject. Marcus, the night shift janitor, once commented to James that he felt something different in the air after a certain hour. A pressure, a weight, as if the whole place was watching you. James never took it too seriously. He was practical, rational. He didn't believe in ghost stories or old building superstitions, but even so, he always respected the rule. He finished his shift before 9 o'clock at night, handed the keys to Marcus, and went home. Simple as that. 15 years without breaking that pattern. 15 years of stability, of safe decisions, of a routine that protected him from any kind of unexpected impact. Then came that Monday in October, the day everything changed. The day, a seemingly innocent choice, accepting to cover a sick colleague's shift, set James on a journey he never imagined possible. A journey that would reveal hidden truths buried in the foundations of that building, truths that had been waiting for almost a century for someone brave or naive enough to uncover them. Because on that Monday, when James's phone rang with Marcus on the other end saying he was sick and couldn't cover the night, something shifted in the air. It was October 14th, a Monday like any other. James was finishing his regular shift when the phone rang. Marcus, on the other end of the line, had that slurred voice of someone who was really unwell. High fever. He wouldn't be able to cover the night shift. He needed someone to cover for him. James hesitated for only 2 seconds. His granddaughter's birthday was coming up. Little Emily would be 7 the following week. He had promised her a pink bicycle with a basket, the kind she saw in the shop window every time they passed by the store together. The extra money from the night shift would be perfect. Just today, James thought, agreeing to cover the shift. A simple decision, practical, rational, like all the others he made in his life. The first part of the night was perfectly normal. James made his rounds through the basement, checked the boilers, noted the pressure readings, and verified that everything was working as it should. The place was perhaps too quiet, but nothing out of the ordinary for someone who knew that space as well as he did. Around 10:30 p.m., some lights in the east corridor began to flicker. Old electrical wiring, almost 100 years old, nothing that surprised James. He had seen it happen dozens of times before. He mentally noted that he would need to replace the ballasts the following week and continued with his tasks. It was almost 11 o'clock at night when he was getting ready to go upstairs and leave. He was already past the unwritten rules curfew, but it was only a few more minutes. Nothing serious, that's when he heard it. A drawn-out slow sound coming from the direction of the dead file, that older area of the basement where yellowed documents, original architectural plans of the building, and dusty boxes that no one had opened in decades were kept. The kind of place even James avoided when it wasn't absolutely necessary to be there. He stopped in the middle of the hallway, holding his flashlight, his breath caught. The sound continued. A heavy, metallic, dragging sound, perhaps, as if someone were moving something large across the concrete floor. The first thing that came to James's mind was rats. The building was old, it had its occasional pests, or maybe it was the pipes, some thermal expansion, creating that strange noise. His practical mind sought logical, rational explanations, But something about that sound made his stomach clench in a different way. James walked slowly toward the archive, the flashlight's light cutting through the dense darkness of that narrow corridor. Each step echoed off the concrete walls. The noise continued, dragging, stopping, dragging again, until he turned the corner, illuminating the entrance to the archive room. And then, in an instant, the sound stopped. Completely. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that seems to suck even the sound of your own breathing. James swept the room with his flashlight. Stacked boxes, rusty metal shelves, layers of dust accumulating on everything. Nothing moving, nothing out of place. He was about to convince himself that he had imagined it all, that tiredness and the late hour were playing tricks on his mind, when the flashlight beam passed over the floor near the oldest boxes, those dated 1927. His heart skipped. A beat. There were marks on the floor. Fresh scratches in the concrete as if something heavy had been dragged recently. The marks formed an irregular pattern that led to the back wall. James approached, crouching down to examine it more closely. The dust around was stirred, and then he saw on the wall scrawled with something dark, perhaps charcoal, perhaps dried blood, he couldn't be sure, a single word in trembling, irregular letters: "Get out." The impact of those 4 letters was like a punch to the gut. James instinctively recoiled, the flashlight trembling in his hand. His brain tried to process it, tried to find an explanation. Was some employee playing a nasty prank? But who else besides him and Marcus would have access to the basement? And those scratches on the floor were real, deep, recent. Someone or something had been there, had marked that wall, had left a warning. If you're feeling that shiver right now, that urge to yell at James to run away, you're already completely immersed in this story. And if you want to understand why he didn't leave, why he came back, you need to subscribe to this channel now, because what happens from here on out will show you how a single decision can change everything. James stood there for long minutes, staring at that word on the wall. James should have gone up those stairs and never come back. Anyone with common sense would have done exactly that. But something inside him, pride perhaps, that silent stubbornness of a man who has spent his whole life solving problems alone, wouldn't let him simply run away. Or maybe it was curiosity, that human need to understand what doesn't make sense, to find the logic behind the inexplicable. Or perhaps it was pure denial, a refusal to accept that something was deeply wrong in that basement. Whatever the reason, when Marcus called on Tuesday saying he was still sick, James agreed to cover the shift again without hesitation. On Tuesday night, things started to become impossible to rationalize. James was making his rounds down the north corridor when he saw the footprints, wet marks on the concrete floor, as if someone had just walked by with soaking wet feet. The pattern was clear, heavy work boot footprints, leaving that dark dampness on the floor. James followed the trail with his flashlight, his heart racing. The footprints led from the archives to the boiler room, then disappeared in the middle of the corridor, as if whoever had been there had simply evaporated. He checked all the pipes, no leaks, no seepage. The ceiling was dry, the walls were dry. There was no physical explanation for those wet marks. And most disturbingly, when James returned to the same hallway 15 minutes later, the footprints had completely disappeared, evaporated, as if they had never existed. On Wednesday, Marcus called again. Still ill. James was expecting the call. Part of him even wanted Marcus to call, because now there was a growing obsession, a need to understand, to prove to himself that he wasn't going crazy. That night brought an even more disturbing revelation. At exactly 3:17 a.m., all the boilers in the basement switched on simultaneously. The noise was deafening in that enclosed space. James almost jumped out of the chair where he was sitting, trying to stay awake. He ran to the control room, his heart racing, all the pressure gauges rising, all the valves open. But nobody had touched anything. He switched everything off manually, his hands trembling as he turned the valves. And that's when he heard it for the first time. Voices, whispers coming from the surrounding walls. They weren't clear words. They were like muffled conversations, multiple overlapping voices speaking at once, as if there were a party happening on the other side of that thick concrete wall. James pressed his ear to the cold wall. The whispers grew more intense, more urgent, but still unintelligible, as if they were trying to say something important, but couldn't quite get through that barrier between worlds. James's transformation was now visible. His daughter Catherine noticed it immediately when he stopped by her house on Thursday to bring Emily a gift. The dark circles under his eyes were deep, almost purple. His hands trembled as he held the cup of coffee she offered him. He had lost weight. His work shirt hung loosely on his shoulders. Catherine asked if everything was all right, genuine concern in her voice. James assured her it was, just tired from the extra work. But she didn't completely believe him. It was that week that James began documenting everything. He recorded audio on his cell phone during the early hours of the morning in the basement, trying to capture whispers, the sound of boilers turning on by themselves, any evidence that it was real. He sent messages to Catherine. "Are you hearing this? Tell me you're hearing it. I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining things." But in the recordings, there was often only static, or sounds so distorted that they could be anything. Reality and his perception were beginning to mix in worrying ways. He barely ate. His appetite had completely disappeared. He slept perhaps 2 or 3 hours a night before waking up sweating, with fragments of dreams he couldn't fully recall. His mindset was shifting. That pragmatism, that rationality that had always defined him, was being eroded night after night by experiences that challenged everything he believed to be true about the world. And the worst part? He couldn't stop. He couldn't simply let go and return to normal life. Something pulled him back to that basement every night, as if there were a hidden truth waiting to be discovered, as if those whispers were trying to tell him something that needed to be heard. On Thursday, James was in the archives for the 4th consecutive night, rummaging through old boxes, searching for any information about the history of that basement. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt there were answers there, buried among those forgotten documents. That's when he noticed something strange on the back wall, right behind the oldest bookshelves. The peeling paint revealed an irregular line in the concrete, almost imperceptible. James ran his fingers along the crack and realized it wasn't a crack. It was a partition, a false wall. With trembling hands, he began to remove the rotten wooden planks that covered that section. The dust that rose made him cough, his eyes burning. And then, hidden in a niche carved behind that wall, he found it. A notebook bound in dark brown leather worn by time, with yellowed and brittle page edges. On the cover, engraved in faded ink, Thomas Brennan, 1926. James carefully opened the journal, the pages creaking under his fingers. The handwriting was meticulous at first, detailed notes on maintenance, repairs, equipment readings. Thomas Brennan was the building's first caretaker. He had started working there during the final months of construction. But as James turned the pages, the writing began to change. It became more hurried, more erratic, and the content of the notes became increasingly disturbing. An entry dated March 1926 read, 17 men. They all disappeared during the final phase of construction. Management says they abandoned the site, left without warning. But I heard rumors among the older workers. There was an accident, a collapse in the foundation area. Men were trapped, and instead of trying to rescue them, instead of stopping construction, they simply covered everything up, poured more concrete, continued building. James felt his blood run cold. He continued reading, page after page, as the hidden truth of that building revealed itself before him. Thomas Brennan had discovered what really happened. During the construction of the Riverside Building in 1924, a serious structural accident had trapped 17 workers in the basement foundations, but the construction company was on a tight deadline, with valuable contracts at stake and investors pressing in. The decision was made behind the scenes, away from the public eye, to cover up the accident, declare the men deserters, and continue construction. 17 lives buried alive under tons of concrete. 17 families who never knew the truth. The diary documented how Thomas began hearing things after a few months working alone in the basement. Knocking on the walls, whispers, shadows. Moving where there shouldn't be shadows. He tried to investigate, tried to find proof of what he suspected. And the more he searched, the more intense the phenomena became. It was as if those trapped souls sensed that someone finally knew. Someone finally cared. The last diary entries were written in trembling, desperate handwriting. James could barely decipher some of the words, blurred as if Thomas had been crying as he wrote. The second-to-last entry read, "They know that I know. I can hear. Them in the walls every night now. They want me to tell, they want someone to know the truth, but I'm afraid. The people who did this still have power. They still control this city. If I speak, I won't get out alive." And then, the last page. The words were written with such force that they tore the paper in places. James read aloud in the absolute silence of that dead file, his own voice echoing back to him. "If anyone reads this, don't stay here alone after dark. They don't want witnesses. They want their story told, but the price is too high. I can feel I won't get out of here. They're surrounding me now. I hear my own footsteps echoing when I'm not moving. I see my reflection in the windows when there are no windows. Forgive me for not being stronger. Forgive me." And the diary ended there, abruptly, mid-word, as if Thomas Brennan had simply vanished while he was writing. James closed the notebook slowly, his hands trembling violently now. He knew what he had to do. He knew that those 17 lives deserved justice, deserved for the truth to be revealed after almost a century of silence. But another part of him, the rational part that still struggled to survive, screamed that he should put down that diary, climb those stairs, and never come back. If you're feeling that weight right now, that impossible responsibility that has fallen on James, then you understand the journey he's on. And if you need to know what decision he made, subscribe to the channel, because what happens from here on out will show you just how far a man can go in pursuit of the truth. James looked at the word scrawled on the wall, "Get out," and made his decision. Friday arrived, the day everything should have ended differently. James woke up that morning with Thomas Brennan's diary beside his bed, where he had spent the night rereading every word, every desperate entry. He should have called the authorities. He should have handed that old notebook over to someone with real power to investigate, to exhume those foundations, to finally bring peace to those 17 forgotten souls. But something was changing inside him, a silent, profound transformation that he himself couldn't fully name. It was more than curiosity now. It was an obsession that consumed every thought, every waking moment. James felt he owed those men something, as if in some inexplicable way he had become responsible for them. Thomas Brennan had failed to tell the truth. He had been silenced by fear, by threat, or by something worse. And now, almost 100 years later, James felt the weight of this untold story pressing against his chest like a block of concrete. He needed to understand it completely. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed irrefutable proof before exposing such a devastating truth. Catherine called in the afternoon, worried. Her voice trembled as she asked if her father was all right, if he didn't want to have dinner with her and Emily that night. James made up some excuse about extra work, an urgent problem in the building that needed solving. He heard the disappointment in his daughter's voice, but hung up anyway. Part of him knew he was making terrible decisions, but another part, the one that now controlled his actions, simply couldn't stop. At 9 o'clock at night, James went down the basement stairs for the last time. He didn't know it yet, but something inside him already sensed it. The diary was in his backpack, along with an old camera he'd found. At home, extra flashlights and water. He was prepared to spend the whole night there if necessary, to document everything, to finally find the physical proof of the truth that Thomas Brennan had discovered. But the moment his feet touched the last step, James knew something was profoundly wrong. The basement was different, not visibly. Everything seemed to be in its usual place, but the air was thick, heavy, difficult to draw into his lungs. The temperature had dropped drastically. His breath formed small clouds of vapor in front of his face, even though it was the middle of October. And there was a smell he couldn't identify, something metallic mixed with damp earth, and something older, deeper. James walked down the main hallway, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The fluorescent ceiling lights began to flicker. Not all at once. It was worse than that. They went out one by one, in sequence, creating progressive pockets of darkness that approached him like a wave. First, the lights in the east hallway went out, then those in the north. One by one, methodically, until only the area around James remained illuminated. He was being surrounded by darkness. That's when he saw them. Not clearly, never clearly. They were shadows that moved erratically, defying all logic of physics and light. Silhouettes of men, 17 of them, scattered throughout the basement. They wore old work clothes, heavy overalls, metal helmets, thick boots. They carried tools, shovels, pickaxes, sledgehammers, and they were working. James stood paralyzed, watching the impossible scene unfold before him. The men dug, they hammered, they erected invisible beams. They moved in perfect synchronicity, repeating the same gestures in an endless loop. It was like watching an old film without sound, the same scene playing indefinitely. They dug, they hammered, and then, James saw with growing horror, they fell, all at once, as if the ground had collapsed beneath their feet. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were standing again, restarting the cycle. They weren't looking directly at James, but he felt their gazes. He felt the weight of 17 pairs of invisible eyes upon him, even when the shadows were turned away. It was a disturbing awareness, like being watched through walls, through time. They knew he was there. They knew he had found the diary. They knew he knew the truth. James raised his cell phone, his hands trembling violently, trying to record the scene. He needed proof. He needed to show the world. But when he looked at the screen, it was black, dead, impossible. The battery had been at 100% just 10 minutes ago. He had checked before going downstairs. He tried to turn it on again. Nothing. As if all the energy had been sucked from the device. And then, at 3:17 in the morning, the boilers burst into life. The noise was apocalyptic. At 3:17 a.m., exactly as had happened on previous nights, all the boilers in the basement exploded in life at the same time. But this time it was different. The intensity was 10 times greater, as if each machine was screaming with all its might. The sound echoed off the concrete walls, ricocheting, multiplying until it became a deafening cacophony that seemed to come from inside James's own head. He covered his ears with his hands, his mouth open in a scream that even he couldn't hear amidst that sonic chaos. And then, amidst that infernal noise, the shadows stopped. They simply stopped. The repetitive movements, that eternal loop of work and fall, froze in mid-air like a paused film. James felt his heart stop too, because for the first time since he had seen them, the 17 figures turned around. Slowly, in perfect synchronicity, they rotated their bodies until they were facing him. James couldn't see faces. They were still just silhouettes, dark shapes against the even deeper darkness. But he felt the eyes, 17 pairs of eyes that carried almost 100 years of pain, anger, and injustice. They began to move, walking toward him, forming a circle that gradually closed in. James tried to recoil, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, not by fear. It was something deeper. It was as if those presences were holding him in place, forcing him to witness, to understand. The emotional impact of that moment was overwhelming. James could feel everything those souls felt. The burning anger at having been forgotten, buried like garbage, erased from history. The despair of families who never knew the truth, who spent decades waiting for men who would never return home. The pain of slow, terrible deaths trapped under tons of concrete while the world above continued building upon their graves. But, and this was the most disturbing thing, none of it was directed at James. There was no hostility aimed at him. It was a plea, a desperate plea that echoed through time. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want to haunt him. They just wanted to be seen, to be remembered, to have their stories told. James understood this with a clarity that transcended words, as if the message had been planted directly in his mind. One of the shadows, the one closest to him, perhaps a leader among the workers, raised its arm slowly. The movement was deliberate, intentional. The figure pointed to the east wall, exactly where James had seen the fresh scratches that first night, where the word "Get Out" was scrawled. The arm remained extended, pointing, insisting, and James finally understood. They weren't telling him to leave. They were showing him where they were, where their bodies had been left. Without fully considering what he was doing, driven by a determination that came from somewhere beyond reason, James walked to the east wall. His hands trembled uncontrollably as he picked up an old pickaxe leaning against the filing cabinet boxes. The tool was heavy, rusty, probably from the same era as those men. He raised the pickaxe and began to strike the concrete. The first impact sent waves of pain through his arms. His hands, already calloused from days of exhausting work, began to bleed almost immediately. The skin broke. Blood trickled down the base of the pickaxe, making the handle slippery. But James didn't stop. He struck that wall with a force he didn't know he possessed, each impact echoing through the basement like thunder. Sweat, mixed with blood, ran down his face. His muscles screamed in protest. But he continued. The shadows watched in silence. The circle around him remained closed but not threatening. It was almost protective, as if they were guarding that sacred moment. James struck again, and this time felt the pickaxe pierce through. There was an empty space behind that wall. With bloodied hands, he began to tear away pieces of concrete, widening the hole, letting the flashlight illuminate what was hidden there. And then he saw bones. White and ancient, but unmistakable. Human skulls. Ribs. Long bones of arms and legs. 17. Skeletons piled up in that narrow space between false walls. Some still had pieces of fabric clinging to their bones, work uniforms from 1926, rusty metal buttons, fragments of leather boots. There was the physical truth, the irrefutable proof of what Thomas Brennan had written. If you're feeling the weight of this revelation, the magnitude of what James just discovered, then subscribe to the channel, because you need to see how this story ends. James fell to his knees before the open wall, his hands bleeding on the cold floor. James couldn't say how long he spent there, kneeling before that open wall, staring intently at the remains of 17 men forgotten by time. It could have been minutes or hours. The concept of time had completely dissolved in that cellar. The shadows around him remained silent for a moment, as if they had finally found the peace they had sought for almost a century. And then, one by one, they simply vanished. Not dramatically. They just dissolved into the darkness like smoke carried away by a gentle breeze. James felt when the last presence was gone. The air grew lighter. The temperature began to rise slowly. The cellar was empty again. It was at that moment that Sarah, the building manager, came down the stairs. It was almost 6 o'clock on Saturday morning, and she had come to check why all the emergency lights in the basement were on. What she found froze her in place for long seconds before she could react. James was sitting on the concrete floor, amidst pieces of destroyed wall and cement dust. His hands were covered in dried blood and open wounds. He held Thomas Brennan's diary against his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And his eyes, those empty eyes, fixed on the open wall where human bones were clearly visible, did not blink, did not move. Sarah called his name, her voice breaking. James didn't answer. She approached cautiously, her heart racing, and that's when she heard it. He was whispering something repeatedly like a prayer or a mantra. I warned you not to stay, I warned you. The exact same words that Thomas Brennan had written in the last entry of his diary, almost 100 years ago. Sarah picked up her cell phone with trembling hands and dialed 911. The police arrived in 15 minutes. Then came the paramedics, the investigators, the forensic experts. The basement of the Riverside Building was transformed into a historic crime scene. James was carried away on a stretcher, still holding the diary, still whispering those words. He hadn't called anyone after making the discovery. He hadn't tried to leave. He simply waited there, as if he knew someone would eventually come. As if his part in this story had ended the moment the wall opened. The forensic investigation confirmed what Thomas's diary revealed and what James had so brutally discovered. 17 human skeletons, all adult males, all killed by severe blunt force trauma, consistent with structural collapse. Dating and analysis of the materials found with the bodies, buttons, fragments of fabric, tools, confirmed that they dated from 1925 to 1926. All had been buried in lime, a clear attempt to accelerate decomposition and hide the evidence. The hidden truth that had been buried with those men finally came to light. The impact on the city of Chicago was immense. The story made headlines in every newspaper. Families who for generations had carried the pain of ancestors who had disappeared during the construction of the Riverside Building finally had answers. Names were recovered through old employment records. 17 men, fathers, brothers, sons, who had been erased from official history, were now recognized as victims of one of the greatest hidden tragedies of the American construction era. The scandal revealed not only this specific case, but opened investigations into dozens of other old buildings constructed at the same time, under the same conditions of haste and corruption. The Riverside Building was evacuated immediately. No one would work or live there anymore. The demolition decision was made within weeks. James was hospitalized for extreme exhaustion, severe dehydration, profound psychological trauma, and hand injuries. Doctors said he had lost almost 10 pounds in a week. He hadn't slept properly for days. His body was in a state of collapse. But what worried the healthcare professionals most was his mental state. James constantly repeated to doctors, nurses, psychologists, anyone who entered the room, they just wanted to be remembered, that's all. That's all they wanted. But the price was too high, too high. There was a permanent transformation in him, something in his eyes that would never be the same again, as if he had seen something that definitively separated the before from the after in his life. Catherine, James's daughter, stayed by her father's side throughout his hospitalization, holding his hand. As he stared blankly into space, James never went back to work. In fact, he could never again enter a basement without feeling that tightness in his chest, that difficulty breathing that made him recoil immediately. The transformation those 3 days had caused in him was permanent and profound. He had crossed an invisible line between the world he knew and something much vaster and more disturbing. And there was no going back. The company offered early retirement with full benefits, part compensation, part recognition that James had done something extraordinary, even at the cost of his own peace of mind. 6 months after that fateful Friday, the Riverside Building was demolished. But before the demolition, something rarely seen in modern Chicago history took place. A full ceremony was held on the site. The 17 workers were finally identified through old employment records, birth certificates, and in some cases, DNA testing with descendants still living in the area. Each one was given a name back. Each one had their story told publicly. Families who for 4 generations had carried the weight of unexplained disappearances could finally mourn their dead properly. The remains were buried with dignity in Oakwood Cemetery, each with a headstone engraved with their name, dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Finally home, finally remembered." James was present at the ceremony, even though Catherine had begged him not to go. He stayed in the back, away from the cameras and the journalists who still wanted to interview him. As the coffins were lowered one by one, witnesses said they saw James weep silently, his lips moving in words no one could hear. Perhaps he was saying goodbye. Perhaps he was asking forgiveness for not being able to help sooner. Or perhaps he was simply telling them that his mission was complete. They would never be forgotten again. But the story has layers that were only revealed later. Marcus, the night shift caretaker who had fallen ill the very week everything began, carried a secret for months. Guilt gnawed at him until finally one winter afternoon he sought out James at Catherine's house. What Marcus confessed changed everything. He hadn't actually fallen ill that week. He had sensed something in the basement weeks before, a growing presence, an urgency in the air, as if the building itself were trying to communicate something. The same flickering lights, the same muffled whispers, the same sensations James would later experience. But Marcus, unlike James, made a different choice. He ran away. He simply stopped showing up for work, invented the story about the illness, and let someone else deal with whatever was happening down there. He knew. On some intuitive level, Marcus knew that something wanted to be discovered, that there was a truth waiting to come to light, but he chose self-preservation. He chose his own peace over the justice those souls awaited. And James, unaware of any of this, had agreed to cover the shifts, walking directly into a journey that would change his life forever. This revelation raises a disturbing question. Was James brave or cursed? Was he chosen for some specific reason, or was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Marcus lives with the guilt of having run away, but he also lives with his sanity intact, with his nights of sleep intact. James gave voice to the forgotten, brought justice where there was only silence, but paid a price that perhaps no human being should pay. Today, James lives with Catherine and his granddaughter Emily in the north side of Chicago. He helps around the house, plays with his granddaughter, and tries to live a normal life. He rarely talks about those 3 days. When questioned by journalists or curious onlookers, he politely deflects the subject or simply says he doesn't remember many details, which isn't entirely untrue, since parts of that experience seem to have been erased from his conscious memory, perhaps as a defense mechanism of his own mind. But Catherine knows the truth. On stormy nights when the wind pounds against the windows and thunder echoes through the city, she hears her father murmuring in his sleep. Always the same words, in a tone of voice that doesn't sound entirely his. "You shouldn't have stayed, you shouldn't have stayed." And she wonders if they are James's words to himself, or if it is the voice of Thomas Brennan echoing through time, traversing almost 100 years to warn the one who followed in his footsteps. If you're noticing all the layers of this story, the full weight of the decisions that were made, subscribe to the channel now, because this journey still has one more thing to show you. Because the question that remains is, what if you were James? What if you were James that night? If you heard that dragging sound coming from the archives, saw that word scrawled on the wall, found that old diary telling a story of injustice buried for almost a century, what would you do? It's easy to judge his decisions from afar, sitting comfortably watching this story unfold. But when you're in the middle of that journey, when you feel the weight of that responsibility falling on your shoulders, the choices are never as clear as they seem. This story reminds us of something fundamental about human nature and the world we live in. Some places truly carry memories that refuse to fade. I'm not necessarily talking about ghosts or the supernatural. I'm talking about untold truths, buried injustices, silenced voices that somehow still echo through time. The Riverside Building kept its secret for 99 years. 99 years of people passing through that basement, working there, living above those remains, completely unaware of the tragedy that had been concealed right beneath their feet. And then came James Mitchell, an ordinary man with an ordinary life, who simply agreed to work an extra shift to buy a pink bicycle for his granddaughter. This seemingly insignificant decision set in motion a series of events that changed not only his life, but brought justice to 17 families who had waited 4 generations for answers. There is something deeply moving and at the same time disturbing about this. The idea that sometimes we are called to fulfill a purpose we never asked for, that we never chose, but that somehow becomes ours anyway. The line between courage and obsession is incredibly thin. James was courageous in facing the unknown, in following the clues, in not running away when it would have been so easy to simply ignore the signs. But at some point in that journey, that courage turned into obsession. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping properly. He distanced himself from his family. He put his own sanity at risk. And the question remains, where exactly is the tipping point? At what point does the search for truth become self-destructive? And more importantly, did James have a choice? He gave. Voice to 17 souls erased from history. Families who never knew what happened to their loved ones finally got answers. A historic scandal was exposed. Justice, even if belated, was served. But James paid the price with his own peace of mind. He never again slept a full night without nightmares. He could never again enter a basement. He was never the same person he was before that Monday in October. His transformation was complete and irreversible. So the question that echoes throughout this entire story is, was it worth it? Does the cost James paid justify the impact his discovery had? Do 17 souls finally at peace compensate for one living soul permanently scarred? I don't have the answer to that question. You don't. Perhaps not even James does. Perhaps the only true answer lies with those 17 men who were finally buried with dignity in Oakwood Cemetery, their stories finally told, their names finally remembered. What I know is that this story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about choices, about responsibility, about the price of justice. It makes us question what we would do if we were in James's position. It makes us think about Marcus, who chose to run away and lives with the guilt, but also with his sanity. There are no easy answers here. There is no happily ever after. There is only the complex and painful reality that sometimes doing the right thing comes at a price we may not be prepared to pay. James Mitchell became part of something bigger than himself. His story intertwined with that of those 17 workers from 1926 in a way that transcends time and death. And now, as you hear this story, you too have become part of it. You carry this truth with you. You know the names that have been almost erased. You understand the sacrifice that was made. And remember, some places hold secrets. Some truths are waiting to be discovered. The question isn't whether you'll face difficult choices in life. The question is what you'll do when they appear before you. Will you be Marcus, who felt the calling and chose to protect himself? Or will you be James, who moved forward even without knowing the price he would pay? There is no right answer here. There is only your answer. If you've made it this far to this last minute with me, it's because this story meant something to you. And I want you to be part of this community of people who aren't afraid to delve deep into stories that make us think, that truly move us. So subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, because every week I bring you real stories like this one. Stories that go beyond the superficial, that make you question, feel, and reflect. And leave a comment here. I would have stayed, or I would have left. I want to know what your choice would be if you were James that night. Or if this story touched you in a special way, simply write, I'm with you until the end. I read all the comments truly, and we build this together. Please like the video as well, because it shows YouTube that it's worthwhile to deliver this type of content to more people. Every like makes a difference in ensuring that stories like this reach those who really need to hear them. And look, there's a video over here that will complement everything we've talked about today. It's about other buried truths that came to light when least expected. Click and continue with me there, because this journey is just beginning. Until the next story. And remember, some secrets come at a price. The question is whether you're willing to pay it.